Today we have our Follin speaker, who is actually the author of our All School Beat for next year. So the purpose of the All School Beat is to unite the circles of our community, including all members of the school, Webb families, alumni, and the City of Bell Buckle residents, to foster discussion across the curriculum via the shared experience founded upon reading the same book, and to encourage respect for differing viewpoints of our multicultural and multi-generational community through the book-centered events and discussion groups. Today, author Andrew Marniss will begin a relationship with the Webb School community. His book, Strong Inside, is the choice for the 150th school year all-school read. Marniss has authored not only the extensively researched biography of Perry Wallace, but also a young reader's version, which you have today. Hopefully you all brought your book with you. And this is appropriate even for our middle school students. This book's themes of civil rights and the importance of education, faith, and family, and of course, basketball, should have wide appeal. Mr. Marniss will return in the fall semester to quiz you on what you read. Just kidding. Okay. So he will return in the fall to discuss the book. He's going to talk about reading and writing and sports, and perhaps even meet with the basketball team. And we would like to have an essay or video essay contest in the 2019-2020 school year. Mr. Marniss will host a field trip at Vanderbilt for some of the upper grades this next year also. So please welcome our Follin speaker, Mr. Andrew Marniss.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you, everyone. This is a real honor to be here at such a highly regarded school and to be a participant in your 150th anniversary. As Ms. Little said, hopefully this isn't the first time and the only time you see me. I'm looking forward to coming back next fall after you've had a chance to read the book, and then possibly have a field trip to Vanderbilt where I'm going to show you around some of the sites that Perry Wallace saw when he was a trailblazing student athlete at Vanderbilt in the late 1960s. I want to tell you one story about my day. It's not like I'm constantly walking into rooms where people are standing up when I enter the room and giving me applause. This morning, I have a 5-year-old son, and I was planning to wear brown shoes with these pants today, which were sitting in the back seat of my car because I'm coaching his baseball team. And so last night I had to drive quickly from work to get out to his baseball field, and I was changing in the car, and so I threw my shoes in the back seat. After the game, he's drinking his Gatorade after the game. And I woke up this morning, and he said, Daddy, I poured Gatorade in your shoes. And I thought he was just joking, like, you poured Gatorade in my shoes. Some days he might say I'm like wearing pants made out of toast or something. You never know what your 5-year-old is going to say. So I ran out to my car to get my shoes to wear for today's talk, and they were soaking wet with Gatorade. So he actually did that. That's what my life is like these days. If you have an annoying little brother at home yourself. I want to tell you a little bit about Strong Inside and why I wrote this book. I'm not going to tell you the whole story of Perry Wallace because hopefully you'll actually read the book and have a chance to discover this person for yourself. But Perry was the first African-American basketball player in the Southeastern Conference. He played at Vanderbilt in the late 1960s, from 1966 to 1970. So if you watch an SEC basketball game today, this was a very different league when he entered back then. This was a league that was founded in the 1930s, and until he stepped on the court, there had never been an African-American in the league before that. And I say basketball player because there was one black football player in the SEC who had played earlier that same school year, so a couple of months before Perry at the University of Kentucky, named Nat Northington. He only played in 4 games, and then he transferred to Western Kentucky. So I can't technically say Perry was the first black athlete in the SEC because there was one guy before him. But Perry was the first African-American athlete in the SEC who played an entire season and played an entire career at an SEC school. And the reason I wrote this really has very little to do with basketball. And let me explain what I mean. So you see these pictures here of athletes who have won championships, maybe the Super Bowl or the WNBA title, the World Series, or the NCAA title. And our culture sometimes will call athletes heroes for what they've accomplished on the court or on the field. And that's not why I chose to write this book about Perry Wallace. Yes, he was a great player. If you saw him play, he would probably be one of the best slam dunkers you've ever seen in high school. He was a great rebounder. He was a great shot blocker. He won a lot of high school state championships, 3 in a row at Pearl High School in Nashville. But that's not why I wrote this book. And so for those of you who are sitting out there who could care less about basketball or sports, this book is for you too. If you do like basketball, I know you're going to find parts of it that you like. But this was really about a person who was basically your age, who was a teenager, encountering a lot of different challenges. And a lot of people in this world that didn't want him to succeed, or that hated him, and were putting these roadblocks in his way. And how did he manage his way through that, or over that? And did he always succeed? You know, what did it take out of him to be a pioneer in this situation? So hopefully, regardless of what your interests are in reading, or whether you're into sports or not, you'll find something in this book. And so I was at a school in Arkansas. I had a chance to speak to the University of Arkansas basketball team and to some students there. And earlier in the day, I went by a middle school near Fayetteville, Arkansas, and their nickname was the Heroes at their schools. And so they had this poster on their cafeteria wall that said, "A hero is a person who by word or action makes the world a better place." And when I saw that poster, I had to take a picture of it, because to me that sort of symbolized, yes, this is the reason why I consider Perry Wallace to be a hero, because he did make the world a better place through his words and through his actions. And the cover of the book you see there, that's the same one that you have. That was the hardcover edition of the Young Readers book, and you've got the paperback. So let me compare Perry to some figures you've heard of before. So you guys know Jackie Robinson?
Yeah.
First African-American Major League Baseball player. Perry was similar to Jackie Robinson in some ways, but there are some differences too. So he was, of course, similar in terms of being a pioneer. Perry being the first black player in the SEC, Jackie Robinson the first African-American Major League Baseball player. But Jackie Robinson was an adult by the time he arrived in Brooklyn to play for the Dodgers in 1947. He had already served in the Army. He had already graduated from UCLA. He had already played professional baseball in the Negro Leagues, when they had separate leagues for white players and black players. He was already married, right? So he was already what we would consider a grown-up. He was an adult by the time he got to the Dodgers. Perry was just an 18-year-old kid when he steps on campus at Vanderbilt in the fall of 1966, right? And he's going to be traveling through the Deep South to play these basketball games. To Starkville, Mississippi, and Oxford, Mississippi, Tuscaloosa, Auburn, Baton Rouge. If you've studied your civil rights history, you know that's not an easy assignment for a teenager to be sent to these locations around the South in the late 60s, and often when he would step into these gymnasiums, be the only African-American person in the entire building. And to feel thousands of eyes on him when he stepped onto the court, and to hear all these epithets being shouted at him, and to fear that he might be shot and killed just for stepping out onto the basketball court. And he's just a teenager put in that position. So hopefully you'll be able to put yourself in his shoes. That's what I want you to do when you're reading this book. So try to put yourself in Perry's shoes. How would this really feel? And that's what I think good nonfiction can do, is make you feel something, and make you feel like you've traveled back in time and you're right there. And it's not the type of nonfiction that's just a list of dates and names and facts and figures, but where you actually feel like you're in that situation. So you know who this is right here, right? Rosa Parks. And I consider Perry similar to Rosa Parks also. When she stepped onto that bus in Montgomery, Alabama, according to the segregation and the racism at the time, she was told she was somewhere she was not supposed to be, sitting in the front of the bus. And yet she knew that that wasn't right. That as an American, she deserved to sit wherever she wanted to in that bus. Perry is similar to Rosa Parks, and when he stepped onto the basketball court, he was told he was somewhere he was not supposed to be also. Because nobody that looked like him had ever been allowed to step onto an SEC basketball court before. And like Rosa Parks, Perry knew that that wasn't right. He belonged there just like anybody else. And he had the courage to step onto that court, not just once or twice or 10 times or 20 times, but 120 times. And you think about there being about 30 games in a college basketball season, times his freshman year, his sophomore year, his junior year, his senior year. All the times he steps onto this court where he's hearing people yell the worst things you can imagine. Like I said, he's concerned that he might get shot and killed just for stepping up to the court. And tremendous courage it took for Perry to succeed in that environment, or even just try to play a basketball game in that environment. How many of you have seen this movie here? Hidden Figures. About half of you. Or read this book. Well, this is a tremendous movie. If you haven't seen it, I'd recommend it. And it's about these African American women who worked at NASA, helped with the space program, incredible mathematicians. And until the movie came out, until the book was written, most of us had never heard of these women before. They were hidden figures. So the double meaning to the title, figures in terms of the math that they did, but also hidden figures in history. And there are a lot of people that have been written out of history for one reason or another in so many different areas of life. And so what I enjoy doing, especially about this book, is that I consider Perry Wallace to be a hidden figure also. And most people, until they've read the book, or before Perry passed away, had a chance to hear him in the last few years talk about his experience. They had never heard of Perry Wallace before. He was a hidden figure too. And so for those of you who are interested in writing or making documentary films, right, or writing a screenplay or a play or something, what I would recommend, based on my own experience of doing this book, and this is the first book that I ever wrote, is to look for those hidden figures that you can write into history also. And a lot of times, especially when we think about civil rights, you'll hear about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and Jackie Robinson as if those are the only three people that had something to do with the civil rights movement. You know, if you go into an elementary school and you are there during February, during Black History Month, you'll see a lot of pictures of those people. But there are hundreds or thousands of other people that did interesting and important things. And you can be the ones to elevate them back into history as they deserve. And that was the experience I had with Perry Wallace, doing the research, writing a book, having a chance to tell a story about a hidden figure. And it's really fun to go out and tell a story to people that they haven't heard before. So don't underestimate the power of hidden figures. All right, so I wanted to show you a little bit about where I come from and who I am, why I got interested in this story to begin with. This is me when I was 13 years old. I was born in Wisconsin. We moved to Washington, D.C. when I was in first grade. This picture was when I was a middle schooler, playing baseball at the Boys Club in Silver Spring, Maryland. Had hair then for a while, right? And I was really into kind of the same things I'm interested in now. I was into sports, I was into reading and writing. And so one day I created this magazine that I called AJ's Sports Journal. My middle name is James, Andrew James, Sports Journal. I wrote about my favorite teams, which were the Milwaukee Brewers and the Green Bay Packers. I interviewed a guy named John Feinstein, who back then was a reporter at the Washington Post. Imagine in your library you have books by John Feinstein. He writes sports-related fiction for young readers and nonfiction for adults. But he was the first person I ever interviewed. Created this magazine. It wasn't for a school project or for a grade or anything like that. It was just for fun. You can see at the bottom, I tried to charge $1.75 for my magazine, and nobody bought it, so I still had it, so I was able to take this picture of it. But that's the kind of kid I was when I was maybe a little bit younger than y'all. Fast forward a few years, that's not me, but I wrote that story. When I was in high school, we moved to Austin, Texas, and so I was a student at Austin High, and I was the sports editor of our high school newspaper, and wrote about all the teams. I played on the baseball team there. And one day I was walking down the hall of our high school, and there was a big poster on the wall, and it was advertising a scholarship open to any high school senior in the country to come to Vanderbilt on a Fred Russell, Grantland Rice sports writing scholarship. And these are two old sports writers from the early 1900s who had gone to school at Vandy, and they had now a full tuition scholarship. So this was a big deal to our family. mom showed up at school. She was crying. I had no idea why she was at the school or crying, and it was happy tears, as my kids call it. And she said Vandy had just called, and I had received this scholarship. So that was a big deal. I was going to go to college in Minnesota at McAllister College, but this scholarship made all the difference to me. So it's how I ended up in Nashville. And I started doing articles for the student newspaper at Vanderbilt about really important things like Nerf basketball tournaments, which is this article here. But one day, I happened to read an article that somebody else had written for the paper about Perry Wallace. So this was the first time I ever heard of him. It was when I was a college student myself, and the article talked about the very first time that Perry ever played a game at Mississippi State, in Starkville, Mississippi. I mean, many of you have started reading the book already, maybe just sitting there. The first pages are about the first game that Perry ever played at Starkville. Just like me, you're going to learn about Perry through the same scene. And this is an environment where, as a freshman, back then they had freshman teams in varsity, kind of like they had JV in varsity. So, as a freshman, you weren't even allowed, even if you were the best player in the whole school, to be on the varsity team in college. And so they had a Vanderbilt freshman team that was playing against Mississippi State. Perry had one other African-American teammate that year. And the racism that they endured in the first half of that game was so brutal that at halftime, Perry and his teammate Godfrey Dillard are holding hands in the locker room, sitting on the bench while their coach is talking to them about what's going to happen in the second half. They're thinking about how are we going to survive the second half of this game. And so for me, as a new student who didn't know anything about this school or about Perry, but was really interested in sports, was majoring in history, and was taking a class in African American history, reading these two paragraphs about that scene in Starkville, Mississippi, is what really captured my attention. And I was still a teenager the first time I ever learned about Perry Wallace. So the first time I wrote about him was not for this book that you're going to read. It was just for a paper in college, just like papers you guys write all the time. Now, I had a fear going to my professor of my Black History course that she was going to say, you can't write a paper about a basketball player. That's not serious enough academics. We don't write about basketball in college. And she didn't come up with this quote here, but she was sort of thinking along the same lines as the author of this quote, thankfully, and gave me sort of the blessing and the confidence to write this paper with the idea being that there's no subject that's stupid. If it matters to you, it's worthy. And if it matters to you, you're probably going to go to the extra effort to do a good job of it, right? To do the research, to do the interview. To write in an interesting way. And I think this is a great thing about having the freedom to sometimes choose the projects you're going to work on. Because you can become really, really invested in it. On the other hand, I think there's tremendous value in schools reading books together as a community so that you all have a sort of a common point of reference to discuss the issues that come up in a book like this. So I'm really, really proud that you're doing that. So this is my professor, and today is National Teachers Day, right? So, excuse me, I wanted to acknowledge my professor, Dr. Yolette Jones, who gave me the confidence to write about Perry Wallace, made me feel like writing about sports was a worthy academic subject. And that was way back in 1989. Here we are in 2019. Now I get a chance to talk to students about this project that began in her classroom at Vanderbilt. So I always like to thank Dr. Jones. And this is that paper. So you're holding the book. This is the first time I ever wrote about Perry. You know, this handwritten cover in November 1989 was the first time I ever wrote about Perry. It's fun for me to go back and look at that. So I graduated from Vanderbilt in 1992. I was the publicist for the men's basketball team there for 5 years. I always wanted to work for a Major League Baseball team. Applied to every single team. Was rejected by every single team, but would save the rejection letters because they had the team's letterhead on them. That was cool. In 1998, there were 2 new teams added, the Arizona Diamondbacks and the Tampa Bay Rays. And I got a job with the Rays, so I moved to Tampa and worked for their team their first season. Came back to Nashville a year later because my dream job turned out not to be so fun after all. And was working at a public relations firm in Nashville for almost 20 years. And in that job, it's like an advertising agency. You're doing writing, but it's all on behalf of your company's client. So it wasn't necessarily always very creative writing, or it might be about, a company that makes chairs or makes computers. It wasn't the types of stuff that I was necessarily interested in writing about. And so I began to think about Perry Wallace and this interesting paper that I had done back in college. And so I wanted to show you this quote by Toni Morrison, and she said, if there's a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. Right, so I was not an author yet. Everybody has to write their first book. Perry was the most interesting person that I had ever met or written about for this paper. And I thought it was sort of a crime that there wasn't a book about him already. Someone needs to write a book about Perry Wallace. And then I finally decided, well, maybe that somebody should be me. And so I emailed Perry, who was then a professor at American University Law School in Washington, D.C. And I asked him if he remembered me, the kid that had written a paper about him way back in 1989. And I said that I would like to write a biography about him. And you guys may know this, but you don't have to ask your subject's permission to write a biography about them. You could choose to write a book about anybody you want to, but I really sort of wanted Perry's, at least his cooperation on the book, to know that he would sit down and do interviews with me and introduce me to his family members, and share photos if he had them, or letters and that sort of thing. And he was very gracious, as Perry always was, and he said, yes, go for it. That's good with me. And so the advice I got was to make a list of everyone I thought I wanted to interview for the book, understanding that through research that list would get longer over however long it took to write the book. But they said, look at that list and interview the oldest person on that list first. Do you know why they would say interview the oldest person first? Because they might die. So it's hard to interview a dead person. So the very next day, I found Perry's old Vanderbilt basketball coach. His name was Roy Skinner, and he was the first person I interviewed for the book. And I thought it might take a year or two to do this book. And boy, was I wrong. It took me 8 years. So I spent 4 years on the research before I ever wrote a single word, and then 4 years on the writing. And the research meant a lot of reading of other books, visiting a lot of libraries and archives, and interviewing about 100 people. So even though this book is about one man, that didn't mean he's the only person I needed to talk to. I needed to get a full picture of him from as many people who knew him as possible. And so that paper now turned into these two books. The one on the left, and Ms. Little has some copies of this in the back if you're interested in it also. That's the original full adult edition, which is about 190,000 words. The version you have is about 40,000 words. So that was the difference. It took me 8 years to write the first one, and then about a year to adapt it for the middle school or high school version. And the person who encouraged me to create the student version, a lot of you have heard of Marniss. She's an author in Nashville who wrote Salt to the Sea and Between Shades of Grey and other books, and she writes amazing historical fiction. Lives in Nashville, and I met her at a coffee shop in Nashville, and she told me about this whole world of books for students, and I'm so grateful that she suggested it. So I wanted to show you what the 4 years of research looked like for me. This is a guest bedroom we have at our house. We turned it into an office where I wrote the book, and that is 4 years of research. You see the binder at the bottom with the orange spine? That is the transcripts of my interviews with Perry Wallace. So he's the subject of this book, and you can see how small that is compared to the totality of the research. And so what I did is I looked at every issue. Nashville used to have 2 newspapers back then. I looked at every issue of the papers between his freshman year of high school and his senior year of college to see what was going on in Nashville, so I could put his story into the context of the place that he was living in. I looked at yearbooks from his high school and from Vanderbilt and from Ole Miss and Mississippi State and UT, wherever he played, so that I could see pictures of what it looked like. Again, so when I'm describing scenes in the book, you might know what the color of those seats were at the gym at UT, or what students were wearing on a typical day at University of Mississippi in 1968, or how much it cost to buy. One of the scenes takes place on Valentine's Day, and there was an ad for roses, so I knew what the roses cost back then. All these little details that take you back to those times. I also had to read a lot of books to learn enough to write my own book. And so these are all books that I read about history of the civil rights movement, history of Nashville, history of college basketball. My favorite book is the yellow one in the middle. It's called Pictures at a Revolution. And it's about the best movies that came out in 1968. And that is a critical year in the story of my book. And so I wanted to know, what were teenagers, what was the music they were listening to, what were the movies they were watching, what books were they reading. And I felt like as much as I could take myself back into those times, that it would sort of seep through into the writing, and again, you'd feel like you were there. I would even listen to the radio station in my car. I had it set to a 1960s channel every day, driving to work and driving home, so I was listening to the same music as the characters in my book. The last thing I wanted to mention to you are just some words to think about as you're reading this book, or some concepts to be thinking of. The first one, as I mentioned before, is empathy. And try to put yourself in Perry Wallace's shoes and feel what he's feeling when he's in these situations, and to imagine how you might have dealt with it and compare that to how he handled these situations. Think about the incredible courage and determination that Perry had. And also to think about it in terms of he's not doing this thinking, I need to do the right thing, I need to have courage and determination because someone's going to write a book about me someday, right? He's just living a normal life, or trying to. And yet, time after time, he's put into these incredibly difficult circumstances, and he manages to succeed through them. And to really think about how do you do that? You're going to be confronted with a lot of hate and racism in this book. You'll be confronted with the words that Perry Wallace heard. The N-word appears in this book, not gratuitously, but because that's what Perry was hearing when he would step onto the basketball court. Sometimes even at the home games at Vanderbilt, his parents are sitting there in the front row, and they're having to listen to this too. If Perry's playing a game at Mississippi State, his mom is laying on a hospital bed at Vanderbilt Hospital because she has cancer, and she's listening to the game on the radio, and she can hear that word being directed at her son as she's sick in the hospital. Right? So I confront you with this word because I want you to feel the pain that Perry would have felt in that situation. And so you will never, ever use that word or tolerate anybody else using it. Okay? And I know that some schools this has been controversial if the word is included. It's the worst word you could probably ever use, and that's the reason why it's in there. Okay? You'll understand that. Choices. You'll see Perry confronted almost like those, what are those books called where you choose which direction you want to go, right? But as you're choose your own adventure, this book is not a choose your own adventure, but you'll come to different forks in the road and see which choice Perry took. But you'll see what choice, sometimes bad choices, coaches or administrators took. Think about the choice you would have made. Relevance. This isn't a story of racism that existed in the 1960s and isn't still with us today. All you have to do is turn on TV or read a newspaper or get on your phone, and you'll see plenty of examples of racism in everyday life. Maybe you're experiencing it yourself right now. Right? So this is intended to be a book that isn't just history that's past. It's present with us today also. And then the last point is to think about this concept of being an upstander rather than a bystander. And when Perry was at Vanderbilt, and I interviewed a lot of his white classmates at Vanderbilt, they would say things like, you know, I wasn't the one that was threatening to hurt him when he was on the basketball court, and I didn't call him the N-word, and I didn't slam the door in his face, and I didn't kick him out of the church. That was other people. I didn't do anything. And then they would realize they just told me that they didn't do anything. When they had a classmate or a teammate that was not being treated fairly, that there was injustice in their environment, and they didn't step up to do anything about it. So they remained bystanders rather than choosing to be upstanders. And that's, again, something that wasn't just a choice to be made in 1968 or 69, but to be made in 2019 or 2020 also. So I think there's another lesson of relevance in this book that you can incorporate into your own lives. And so those are the basics of this book that I wanted to share with you before you read it. Again, I'll be back in the fall, not to quiz you with her joke, but to meet with you and to learn about what you think about the book. And then hopefully also to meet with you at Vanderbilt. I live in Nashville. I work at the Vandy Athletic Department. You can find me on Twitter or Instagram, Facebook. You can email me. Like, this is a partnership. When you're reading the book, if you have questions or comments, or you can always contact me anytime. I love interacting with students and teachers and libraries, so let's make the most of this experience of reading this book together. And thank you again for having me with your great school.